All right. So this is the second, count it, two, second Monday matinee. This is Jake Schrantz.
This is Ariana Joy Cobbler.
And we just watched a pretty good movie. I'd never seen it before.
Neither have I. This is my first time. We watched 500 Days of Summer, 500 in parentheses, which I didn't even know was the way that the movie title was until I actually watched the movie, which was pretty cool.
Mm-hmm.
But just as a little basis of knowledge, I guess, it is a PG-13 rated movie that came out in 2009 and is considered a comedy romance and goes up until an hour and 35 minutes.
Yeah, so this movie, it says a comedy romance. That perfectly encapsulates my opinion of this movie. That's exactly what it wanted to get across and what it did get across. So I think it definitely achieved the goal of that. In the beginning, there's a little bit of background, and this is kind of just getting into, first off, spoiler warning for the movie. If you want to go watch it and then come back and watch this review, that's definitely the best way to do this. But in the beginning of the movie, there is a scene that kind of gives some background on a character named Summer. She's one of the main characters in the film. She's played by Zooey Deschanel.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wrote this down because I thought it was really interesting because the first scene where the characters meet is day one. And all throughout the movie, there is kind of like, I would describe it as like a graphic or like just like a full screen of a tree. Yeah. And as the movie goes to different points in the 500 days, the tree signifies or symbolizes how the relationship is, how the two characters' lives are going at that point based on the health of the tree. So in kind of the honeymoon stage of their relationship, it's full of life, it's green, luscious, big tree. As it kind of starts to spiral out of control, same thing happens with the tree. And it's really useful because the way that this movie is formatted, which I thought was really interesting, was it doesn't just go straight chronological.
Mm-hmm.
It jumps between different points in time. So you kind of are left to pick up the pieces of fitting in where these scenes kind of match up in the timelines for these different characters. And I thought that made this movie stand out from other types of romantic comedies in that are out there.
Yeah, and honestly, for the most part, I wouldn't consider it necessarily romantic most of the time. I feel like there's this like dark undertone throughout the entire movie, which I think is a kind of a good way of showing that like not every relationship works out for the best. And I think this is really interesting because this is one of the few romance movies where it's not told in the women perspective, which is pretty cool because personally, I think it's a lot more relatable when it's a male figure because from a woman's perspective, I know what's going on in what's going on in the woman's head, but I don't know what's happening on the other side. So for me, it was a really cool way of showing a not so typical romance through the eyes of someone who is not necessarily the go-to for the lead necessarily for a film like this, and specifically in like early 2000s, which is when this movie came out. And then going into like the actual screenplay of the actual movie, I think it was really cool how it was very intricate in all of the like side characters as well too. I feel like we really got to know all of the characters in the way that they were being represented without going too in depth with what they had in this universe of 500 Days of Summer.
Yeah, I think it's interesting you bring up that point about the male versus female because there's one scene kind of in the middle of their relationship, probably closer to like the downfall of it, when Joseph Gordon-Levitt gets punched at the bar. Yeah. And when they go home, he's like, I just got my ass beat like for you. And even before Zooey Deschanel's reaction to that happened, you like vocally were like, oh, no, like that's not what you're supposed to say. And that's exactly what the character did on screen. So it's cool to see like how different people would relate to scenes because as a guy, I saw that scene where he was like, didn't you just see what I just did to like protect you or show you how much I respect you? Like, and that it was interesting to see that back and forth between the two characters at the time.
Yeah, I kind of feel like that's really the whole basis of this film, is really showing that like there's differences between all people, especially within relationships. And I feel like this movie did a really good job of focusing in on these two characters who definitely are not meant to be with each other. And I think that's one thing that was really cool about this film, is that as soon as you get in, there's these title slides, basically, of like lower thirds of the director, like doing their director's note, basically.
Yep.
Which I thought really cool that they did this, but you go into the movie knowing that it's not going to work out for these two characters. So it's kind of like this weird juxtaposition of like, they're obviously not meant for each other. So you guys have to kind of pick and choose which side you really want to be on.
Yeah. And I think some of the comedy comes out in this movie. I would say mostly in the parts where Gordon Levitt's character is like depressed after the relationship doesn't work. Like there's a scene, I think it's after he finds out he was actually at the girl's, like, what would you call that? Like a marriage ceremony or
engagement party?
Engagement
probably?
party.
Yeah.
He realizes that, he goes home, he's distraught. And then all movie long, there's those shots with the graphic where it goes from like day 50 to day 220 to day 99. It goes just to like day, let's say 260, and it shows him waking up, being depressed, going to the store in like a robe, getting like Twinkies, eating that, and then it just goes to the next day and he's doing the exact same thing. Like, I thought that was just a really funny way to show depression in a way that got the point across but didn't need to like ruin my mood for the entire day.
Yeah, I agree. And even like the movie itself had aspects within it where, yes, it was comedy, but it was very like dark comedy. Even like his friends, the way that he would make fun with his friends, especially in the middle of the movie when his friends were like, "What are you doing? This is definitely not how it's supposed to be. You should just get over it. Like, what's wrong with you?" All of these things. And it really shows, like, for the most part, as a man, like, you kind of just have to go about it and not care. And even like, it was kind of funny because a big part of this movie is his job as a role. And he works as a greeting card designer and like copywriter, essentially. So he's the one who makes all the corny little like quotes and stuff when you open, like when you go to Target and you go and buy like a birthday card, stuff like that. In this world, he is the one who makes those. So it's kind of funny that when he does get depressed, it's acknowledged by the entire like company that he is not doing his job well because of this thing that happened. Everyone knows why he's like this. And it's kind of cool because as he gets more and more depressed and more like not willing to do his job doesn't fire him. He actually ends up quitting, which I think was pretty cool. And it's that moment when he decides to quit his job is actually when he becomes not depressed, which is kind of cool and ironic, I think, because he was surrounded by all these happy people doing all of these like card making and doing all these like wholesome things within like the quotes and stuff. And until he got away from that is when he became like more happy.
Yeah, and it's also the way that his job played into the plot of the story. You brought up when he was going through a rough time after the relationship didn't work out. When it was working out, he was like the golden boy of the office. Like if any of the topic or the genre people needed help to get through a writer's block for a card, they could go to him. And at the time when the relationship was working, he could come up with like the perfect line for every card. So it was kind of cool the way that his job and just overall his success in life was shown related to the relationship. Like when things were going smooth and things were going good and he was happy, everything around him seemed to be working like a smooth operator. Like there was no bumps, there was no hardship. And then once things started to get a little bit rough and his relationship with Summer started to fall apart, that's when he started to hate his job and think, man, is this really what I want to do with my life? So that was definitely an important part of the movie, I'd say.
Yeah.
In terms of performances, I think my favorite one was probably Chloe Grace Moretz, who was pretty young in this movie.
Oh, yeah.
But she had probably some of the funniest lines. Like, I wrote down a couple of them here. I wrote down that she was comedy gold in this movie. The quote is, just some guy with Brad Pitt's face and Jesus's abs. Just like seeing like a 13-year-old girl in this movie say that line, I thought that was pretty funny. That I wasn't expecting that. And the way that she just like talked to she was like the younger sister of the main character. So the way that she just like talked to him as if they were both like adults, I thought was pretty funny.
The very first scene, which is like basically a cut to the present time of him like freaking out about like Zooey Deschanel's character Summer breaking up with him. It's literally her breaking into his apartment and saying what's wrong and forcing him to drink alcohol, which is kind of funny.
Yeah, as he's just like slamming plates on the ground, like ceramic plates.
Yeah.
Like,
which is so like random, but I think was really funny. And I do think that she added a lot to this character because this is one of the few times where most of the actual like shots were either in like New York setting, or it wasn't set in New York, it was set in Los Angeles. But it was either like in a corporate building or in his apartment or something like that. So all of the scenes with his sister were all done like on a playground, on a soccer field, and I feel like it really showed that there's a lot more to his life than what was being shown, which was kind of cool.
I think another cool factor of this movie that I kept writing down notes about was the way that there were different events in their relationship and different scenes that would get repeated, but because the context of when it happens in the 500-day timeline, because of when it's placed, it ends up having a different result. Like one of them was when they're at IKEA, and I was surprised they showed this pretty much back to back. They show the later timeline one where Summer doesn't really react to like a joke that he says. And then right after that, it cuts to a prior time in their relationship where they're making kind of jokes at each other as if they're like living in a mansion together in IKEA with all of this kitchenware and furniture everywhere. They're kind of just joking, messing around, running around the store. But then later on in the relationship, Joseph Gordon-Levitt tries to make that same reach out joke, and she kind of just gives him the cold shoulder. I was like, dang, that's pretty sad to see, because just before this, they were like having some of their best times together at that place.
Yeah. And one thing that I did notice throughout this film was the use of color, which was really cool. I feel like there was a lot of like symbolism within the color that was being used. Zooey Deschanel's character, I feel like a big reason why she was even considered for the part was because of her blue eyes. I think that was a very important part of the character, because the person itself was never seen wearing anything else but a shade of blue or a shade of gray, something like that. But then Tom, who is Joseph Gordon-Levitt's character, Tom, is never seen in anything other than like a red for the first part of the film. And as he becomes more acquainted with Summer, he starts to wear more like neutral colors and grays and stuff like that. The moment that I really started to realize it was when they had that big, like almost like Broadway performance scene where
like a dance scene.
Yeah, there's like a dance scene where it's all definitely going in his head at the time, but he's basically so happy that him and Summer are starting to work out and stuff like that. And so he's kind of like prancing through the city on his way to work. And he is the only one in this body of people wearing red. And I feel like that really shows how much of red is associated with like love. And obviously when you go like to Valentine's Day, you go and get like chocolates, whatever, it's always going to be in red and pink and shades of like brighter colors. But then people who might not be associated with the love, which is someone like Summer, who she said in the very beginning of the film, she doesn't believe in love because her parents never believed in love. They got divorced at a really early age and stuff like that. So it really just shows throughout the film, you can tell who cares about love and who doesn't, which now that I'm really thinking about it, both of his roommates were not wearing red at all. And one thing that I was really confused about was one of his roommates were always wearing the blue nursing outfit. And it was weird because Tom would always say that his roommates were unemployed. So that kind of makes me think about it a little bit more about the choice of him wearing that blue nursing outfit if he was unemployed. But
no, I did not pick up on that specific example.
But it's just those little details specifically within the color choices where everything kind of aligns with what the character's beliefs were, which I think really takes it an extra level.
Yeah, I think we can kind of steer the conversation more toward the technique and the aesthetic of this film. You mentioned how important color was in that dance scene. He's walking through the streets and all the people he comes across are like in the blues and like the kind of neutral colors, like you said. But his smile, and I think he's wearing like a red tie.
Yeah,
I want to say
he's wearing a red sweater vest and a red tie and just like a gray shirt.
Yeah, so every person he comes across and he's like flashing a big smile at them. They all keep turning their shoulders to look at him, and they start to feel better. Like you can see them kind of warming up to that as like a feeling inside them. But also something else that I think I forgot to mention in that early scene was when they're showing the background and almost like the youth of Summer in the beginning. There's a couple shots, and they do it also, I think, for the character Tom, but they go to like almost this old timey, like black and white, like
so cool.
film style of shot where it's like kind of like a square box, but not the full screen.
Yeah, it looks like cartridges, like film cartridges almost.
Yeah, and the first thing I thought of was because we recently watched Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. They did that a bunch in that movie because of the era that it took place in, and they would call back to the characters' different roles that they'd had. It reminded me of that where they would just randomly cut, not randomly, but they would cut to, they weren't even real life scenarios. It was almost
like fantasy. It was
it was like
what
a fantasy.
he wished could be seen on, like as if one of the dates that they frequently went on was like going to the movies, and I think that's why it was so important.
Another part of like the cinematography and the shots that I really liked outside of just those kind of black and white fantasy or like imagination scenes, those are pretty creative. But one that was pretty, I would say subtle, but also not so subtle, was after they had that argument in the house after the scene at the bar. He ends up leaving. He takes the stairs out of her apartment, and it takes like a tilt. Takes like a tilt down the stairwell. And it's like it's like just a common apartment staircase where you go down and you keep going around and around. I saw that. Yeah, I saw that as a spiral, and it kind of symbolized how that was like the pivotal moment, the tipping point of their relationship, and how at that point it was spiraling pretty much down the drain. That's the direction that Joseph Gordon-Levitt was going. And I thought that was, I mean, they could have had him just go tap a button on the elevator and go down. But no, they wanted to be more creative and more symbolic in the film. And I think that's what elevates this from just a regular rom-com you would see released on Netflix.
I feel like that's so, the reason why it's so good is because cinematically it's so specific, and you can really just get into every single detail about why the director decided to do this and why they decided to place him in this setting, stuff like that. Even like the certain aspects of the way that the camera gets panned and the way that like one thing that I really noticed that this director loved to do was pans into darkness and then going into another room and there's another group of people there or something like that. And I really, really like when people do that. because aesthetically it just looks really cool when all of a sudden you're going from one room and into another room seamlessly, and it looks
Yeah.
like it's supposed to do that.
Yeah, I just feel like if you're not really a fan of rom-coms or kind of just these dramatic movies, it's a little bit more than that. It's not just, like I said, it's not just your regular run-of-the-mill like romantic comedy that is formulaic. It tells you from the beginning that these characters aren't going to work out together, but over the course of the movie, you end up pulling for them and hoping that what they told you in the beginning was not going to be true, but it ends up being a very satisfying ending, and it doesn't follow the same formula where, oh, they start to fall in love, they fight in time, they go apart for a while, and then they come together in the end. Like, it's kind of refreshing to watch, I would say.
Yeah, I agree. I do think this would be a perfect movie for, like, one thing that I always know that is hard, especially for couples, just trying to figure out a movie to watch. I think that this is a great movie for women and people who just love, like, having that sense of romance in the movie. But this is like a good middle ground where it's still like cinematically such a good movie, and there's always something to talk about. Like, for example, we haven't even started and talked about the soundtrack. The soundtrack in general is amazing, and it gives like this retro feel, which is kind of funny because it's in 2009, which is peak pop, I would say.
Yeah, I feel like the best soundtrack scene was the dance scene where they're dancing to the Hall & Oates song. That was like really well choreographed, and there's like plenty of those scenes where they intertwine the music and the rhythm of the song into like what's going on, whether it's like the footsteps of a character kind of following the tempo. So yeah, that was another underrated aspect of this movie, I would say.
Yeah. The reason why I wanted to watch this movie so bad is because I kept seeing the TikTok sound about there's this iconic section where they go into the elevator and he's listening to his music, which I find funny that he has like retro headphones on, even though he's like 20 years old in this film. He should not be having some janky old headphones, if we're being honest. But then Summer Zoe Deschanel's character is like, oh, I love the Smiths. And that is the TikTok sound that went viral about like 6 or 7 months ago. And I mean, I see it everywhere, and that's a big reason why I wanted to watch the movie. And seeing it happen in the movie in the context of all of the things that I have watched up until that point, it was completely different than what I expected it to be.
So overall, as we kind of wrap up this review, what would you give this movie?
Overall, I do think this is one of my favorite, like, overall likeness. I have liked it a lot. But in general, I'd probably give it about maybe like a 7.5 out of 10. Yeah.
I think that's similar to where I'm at on Letterboxd, which if you guys want to peep our Letterboxd accounts, go ahead and give us a follow. They'll be in the description for this video. We'll be putting all our reviews kind of in summary in like a text format on there. But I would probably sit at around similar range where it's like a 3.5, maybe just under a 4 for this one. Just because if it didn't have the cinematic and the intentional shot usage that it did, I feel like it would fall a bit lower, maybe to like a 2.5 or a 3. But because of how intentional every single important sequence was, I feel like it raised the bar for what these movies should be going forward.
Yeah. And just to put that in perspective, I said 7.5 out of 10, and you said 3.5 out of
3.5 like
5.
stars, yeah, out of 5.
So to put that in perspective, I just looked up what the averages on all of like the big mainstream ones were. So on IMDb, it was a 7.7 out of 10, which was very close to what I put it at. And then on Rotten Tomatoes, this was an 85%, which is fairly good, I would say, because I feel like Rotten Tomatoes is very much more like opinionated, I would say. And then on Letterboxd, it was a 3.6 out of 5. So we're right around the same range as what most people would accurately think that this was at.
Yeah, I definitely agree with the public on this one. Sometimes they're way off from what I think, but yeah, I think that's a pretty accurate reflection of how good this movie is. Definitely something you could rewatch pretty much over and over again just to keep catching those cool shot sequences and different musical aspects. But with that being said, I think that kind of wraps up Monday Matinee number 2 for 500 Days of Summer. If you guys have some movie suggestions you want us to review next time, go ahead and leave them in the comments. We'll take a look at them, see if we can fit them into the schedule. But yeah, for this whole movie, I think it was a good experience.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. But again, just come and see us next week. We'll be here every Monday. And if there's any new releases, we'll also be coming in. Again, we also do like regular vlogs and stuff like that too. So just subscribe and make sure to tune in as much as you can. We really appreciate it.